Hi there, welcome to the Nitty Gritty Writing Podcast. I'm Simon Cantan.
And I'm Dave Higgins.
And this week we're going to be talking about should you confine yourself in order to build your readership faster. But first we'll do our weekly roundup. And Dave, as usual, you can go first.
Right, another episode of Seven Stones, planned, written, polished and published. I've managed to crack the ending of the story I was stuck on, I think. So I've been going back through that from the start, putting a different bit of plot in to support that. So fingers crossed that'll all hold together. And I picked up another client. So I've been doing a bit of preparation for that. So that's me for the week, I think.
Good. For me, so last week I was saying I was doing loads of coding, and that was meant to be the week when I was finished the coding and then could go back to writing. But there was too much wrong that I needed to fix. So I spent the whole week coding on the website again this week. And then on Thursday, I think, I then got the beta reading thing to a stage where I could let a few readers in to try it out. So it's still kind of not where I wanted to get it, but it was kind of as good as it was going to get without me spending more weeks on it. So the styling is kind of crappy, but it works, which is, I've kind of the engineer's approach to things. It works, but it doesn't look very pretty. So apart from that, I did a new cover for Hard Vacuum, which I actually was going to show off briefly, if anyone's interested. Let's see.
Shiny pictures.
So that's the new cover there. So the previous cover, if I can find that. Easier to just share my whole desktop. Let's see. So the previous picture is that, which is just empty picture of space. I think I showed it before in our cover design episode. And then this one is the exact same space picture, just with a massive space station in it instead. And the reason I did that was because I was looking at the genre that I was in, military sci-fi, and they're all pictures of spaceships in space. So my picture of empty space wasn't an exact match for the conventions of the genre. So I just put something in. It's the first in the series, and it's just a quick read, like an hour-long read. But so it's the most important one to fix, and then I'm going to have to go back and do the others in the series because they're all just pictures of empty space. So I want to get the whole thing kind of more in line with what the genre looks like. It's actually one of the best conversion books I have. People who read Hard Vacuum, at times it's about 10% of people then go on to read the sequel. So that's pretty good. So I did that, and I also wrote, I think, a couple of thousand words on a short story I'm doing for a compilation for a bundle. So that's been quite interesting because I came up with what I think is an interesting idea about where virtual reality and stuff could go. So I've started in on that. Yep, that's about it, I think. Next week, hopefully, I'll be doing a lot more writing. Oh, one other minor note was the paranormal fantasy book bundle I was going to be in October has fallen apart. So there was 10 of us said we were going to all write new books to be in a bundle, where the plan was the bundle would be released with 10 novels in it that had never come out before. And we all had fairly substantial mailing lists. So all of our fans would then buy it. And that, like, say the average was 1,000 people, and there's 10 of us, that'd be 10,000 people maybe buying it. Even if it's only 10% of people or something, it's still 1,000. So that would drive it up the charts. And we were going to do BookBub, or try to at least, and other things. But only 2 of us managed to write our novels. So after that, then there was no point in there's no point in doing a 2-book bundle. That's not a bundle. So both of us decided, no, let's just release them individually as individual books. So yeah, on bundling in general, one of the bundles I'm in has been delayed by a month, and one of them has been cancelled entirely. So my feeling is that it needs someone taking the lead on it. And I think the best fit is someone who already has a fairly substantial following in the genre, because then they've got something to offer people who are then joining the bundle. Like if they're already a top 100 seller in military sci-fi, and they say to a bunch of military sci-fi authors, hey, we'll all write books, and in 6 months' time we'll put them all in a bundle, and the first month of release is going to be just this bundle, and we're going to get it on, USA Today bestseller or whatever. That's a draw. Whereas, like, if I said that, then it's not appealing enough. If Hugh Howey, for instance, said, I'm going to do this bundle, he'd get tons of people who would, then if you whittle that down to the people who actually write the book after 6 months, he'd end up with, at least a dozen people in a bundle, which would be good. So in general, the dystopian one is still going, but we've changed the rules entirely. That was meant to be the same thing, new books, because I haven't seen it before, at least, of someone trying to put new novels into a bundle that have never been released before, because then you've got your entire fan base buying it. Like a short story, there's not many people like short stories, unfortunately. And if it's a novel that's previously been published, then all your fans already have it if they're going to buy it. So a bundle is only then finding new readers. It's not as big of a push. So yeah, anyway, that's what's happened with bundling. So I have to figure out my calendar then going forward. Because it was going to be a big crush with the dystopian book and our books, fantasy books, and the paranormal fantasy all coming out in the same 31-day bit in October / 1st of November. So that doesn't make any sense really if I can space it out. So I might push the paranormal fantasy out until next year, because I don't think I can get it ready by September 1st, and then October, November, December is taken up. So anyway, yeah, that was a long kind of status update. So onto our topic. So one thing you and I, Dave, have discussed a lot is genres, and the fact that most people don't read across genres.
Yeah.
So I'm a lot more restricted than you are. So I tend to read science fiction and fantasy, tiny bit of horror, and then occasionally the bestseller in some genre if people are raving about it. So I read Da Vinci Code, for instance, but I'm not really a thriller reader otherwise. Whereas you would read absolutely anything, pretty much.
Within reason. I don't tend to read as much of the famous literary books. So Will Self, Jonathan Franzen, the things that make the top 10 books that you should be reading instead of the crap you are reading in highbrow magazines. But thrillers, horror, fantasy, science fiction, some romance. I read less romance than other things, but I do read enough of it that I read it. Yeah. So
sorry, go ahead.
I'm very different. I'm very definitely an outlier on the curve when it comes to this, reading books that are like the book you've just read, which I know a lot of people do.
Yeah. Sorry, just to derail it for a 30-second thing. This week I watched a series on Netflix that was called Scrotal Recall, which is a very light romance. You mentioned romance, and it just reminded me of that. Like a very light-hearted romance, like Four Weddings and a Funeral. So just on the terms of like audience expectations, something called Scrotal Recall seems like it should be a comedy for 14-year-olds. Anyway, sorry, that's just my brain misfiring. So back to what we were talking about. So most people then, I would say, are more restricted even than I am, from what I hear from people. So readers will say, oh, you're writing serious fantasy or paranormal fantasy. Well, that's not the same as the lighthearted fantasy I like that you write. So my feeling is that there's two reasons for that, perhaps. The first is that readers expect something from you as a brand. Like they're saying, your package, Simon Cantan or Dave Higgins, is one specific type of books. And why are you writing something else? I go to this other author, John Smith, for this type of, hardcore fantasy. Like an example of movies would be Kevin Smith, where for a long time he made silly kind of teenager kind of oriented comedies, which I enjoyed. And then he said, okay, now I'm going to do horror movies and things like that. And most people then weren't interested in his horror movies. Whereas if it had been John Smith making the same horror movie, people might have gone, well, this is really an interesting new director doing horror movies. So I think that one of the reasons is that people have put you in a box and said, you're the funny fantasy guy, or you're the, whatever it happens to be guy. And I go to Dan Brown for thrillers. Why are you writing a thriller, or whatever it happens to be? And the other reason I think is that some people tend to find what they like and just stick with it. So it depends on the genre, I think. So science fiction, I don't know, maybe I'm prejudiced, but I think that science fiction readers in general are looking for new experiences. They're not really looking for the same thing over and over. Whereas a subgenre like military sci-fi, they do kind of want the same thing over and over. They want the same military structure in the ship, and they want the same kind of captain and the same kind of crew. You couldn't you could write a curmudgeonly captain who's really strict, but then if you turn around and write a captain who is like a teddy bear who is really soft and is always trying to talk his way out of things and negotiate and use diplomacy, and he's always smiling and all that kind of thing. I think most military sci-fi fans would say, that's not military sci-fi, I hate this. Unless, there's exceptions to everything. If you were, an exceptional writer, you could somehow work around that.
I think that's there, and you could you could take that premise, and a good writer could write a good book, but that book wouldn't, as you say, be military sci-fi. That doesn't make it any less of a good book. It means it doesn't fit that specific box.
But I think it's about your goals. So if your goal is to write your specific book and you don't care that it's only going to sell 12 copies, then that's fine. Like, of course you can write that book. I think you're going to have trouble, because otherwise you're having to invent a new audience. If you write a military sci-fi where it's essentially Adama and the rest of them, but just with different names and, you know, slightly different personalities or whatever, then you already have a built-in audience who like that and are willing to read a slight variation, which to me personally would be deathly dull to read slight variations on the same book over and over and over. But it seems like there's a lot of people who are just want to do that.
There's possibly a third reason to your people expecting you to be like something, and that if people, that potentially, one of the reasons why my reading is so broad is because I read much quicker than average. So I started reading romance because I thought, well, I'll read a romance book because I'm not going to dismiss an entire genre without having read any of it. And I like paranormal romance, so there's no reason why I'd loathe romance necessarily. So I picked one up and I read it, and it took me about a day and a half of my reading time to read a romance novel. And I knew going in that it would take me sort of about 2 evenings, slightly under 2 evenings, to read the book. So that's nothing really when it comes to risk. And if I go in committing 2 evenings to doing something, so is there anything really where you'd go, oh, it's not worth the risk of 2 evenings to do it for free? Just borrow a romance book from the library, and if I do like it, that's great. If I don't like it, I haven't really lost any time. Whereas for someone who it takes them a week to read that book, that's potentially their entertainment for the entire week that they're taking a risk on. So I think possibly another reason why people won't cross genres is, even if they think you're a good comedy writer, they don't know whether or not that means you'll be a good thriller writer. So they might not be prepared to take the risk. It's not just that, well, I get my thrilling from Dan Brown. It's that, well, I don't know if I trust Samsung to make skateboards or whatever. So they won't, even if they trust the brand, they won't jump to something else from the same brand because they don't know if they're going to like it.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, as you said, that I do exactly the same thing with music, where the Arctic Monkeys started off by playing really hard kind of rock music, fast rock music, and then moved into much slower, kind of gentler music as their albums went on. And the music is still good, but when the albums first came out, I was disappointed because I was thinking, well, I want another hard, fast rock music album, whereas they wanted to make something different to what they made before. So you've got the expectation there when some new book comes out, for instance, that it's going to be exactly the kind of thing they got before, except, you know, a new variation, slight variation on it. So there's a disappointment that immediately creeps in when they go, oh, this isn't that. So anyone who's a fan of my Bitter End fantasy books, we're hoping will like the Dragons and Magic series because they're quite similar, but they wouldn't like, or they may not like, my dystopian or my vampire book because they neither have humor and they're very kind of different genres, subgenres of science fiction and fantasy. So it is, I don't know, it's a difficult thing to kind of, because on the one hand, I wouldn't be happy just writing the same thing. Some authors are. I mean, Terry Pratchett wrote however many Discworld books, 50 something, maybe 60 something, a lot.
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a lot. Yeah.
And they're all the same tone, more or less. The same city/nation, at least. But they do tell quite different stories. I mean, they're telling about different people in the city, and so they are quite different in that sense, but they are consistent in their tone and their genre and their setting. And that's fine if obviously if that's what you enjoy writing, then you're it's a massive benefit to doing so. But I want to kind of do more than that in my writing. I don't know what I'm going to want to write in 5 years' time. I could turn around and go, okay, I'm bored with science fiction and fantasy. Now I just want to write Agatha Christie style murder mysteries. It's not very likely, but it could happen. I don't want to make my entire writing career just about one subgenre. That would be quite dull.
Yeah.
And as well, I write so quickly that I potentially can put out, like, we're going to put out 3 titles this year that are lighthearted fantasy, whilst I'm also putting out a bunch of titles which are not, which are other things. So I wonder, is the question about keeping plates spinning, basically, that you can start spinning a plate that's lighthearted fantasy, but you have to keep something going every so often. Like, I've noticed my mailing list, for instance, the open rates are plummeting because I haven't had any books out for 7 months now or something like that in total, like at all. And then the people who have written to me who are, you know, big fans of my books have been saying, okay, when's the next lighthearted fantasy book coming out? They don't really care that I've got a vampire book or a dystopian book coming out. So I guess what I'm saying is that every subgenre that you start write and a series in is something that you're going to have to spin the plate for in order to keep people interested in that. Or I guess you can just let it slide and realize that a certain percentage of your fan base are just going to move on and not look for your books anymore.
I was thinking there are 2 aspects to the question that we haven't covered. I mean, we've sort of, so far we've 2 aspects of the question, one of which we haven't covered. So far we've covered whether readers will transfer across from one type of book to another. I think another aspect to the whether you should confine yourself to build a brand is whether there are actually any books that don't go together with a different type of book to such an extent that trying to do both will actually harm your career. And for instance, the one that springs to mind is children's books and hard line, edgy, pornographic erotica. And trying to put both of those out under the same author name would probably backfire, even if they were both written superbly to fit their respective genres. But I'm questioning, well, if you write light-hearted fantasy, does publishing crime thrillers damage your brand? So I'd say it wouldn't. It just doesn't gain you the same momentum of having lots of books out in the same genre. Yeah. So do you think that trying to run two lines in parallel will damage your brand, or is it only going to be, well, it has to be almost two opposing types of book?
I think it's down to take a less extreme example. If I so I've got my bitter end books, which are quite lighthearted, and then if I wrote a Stephen King-esque torture porn type of book, and people read that without, like, if the product description wasn't explicit enough to say, and people ignore those anyway, wasn't explicit enough to say this is disturbing and you shouldn't read this if you like lighthearted stuff, that's enough, I think, for someone to never read one of your books ever again. If they are expecting some, you know, humorous good guys versus bad guys thing, and they read something where, you know, people are slicing each other open and stuff, they'll put the book away and go, okay, well, forget that author then. I don't like that stuff. Or another way to put them off may be that you have, say you had, most of your books are politically, that don't mention politics at all. But you have one book where you say, okay, so I'm a hardcore liberal and this is what I believe and blah, 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 blah. And this is an amazing society where everyone looks out for each other or whatever. That as well could potentially turn off readers. Bradley Cooper just had that at the Democratic National Convention. I don't know if you saw, Dave. So Bradley Cooper played Chris Kyle in American Sniper, which was a very pro-war movie. I haven't seen it, but from what I understand, it's a very pro-war movie. So Republicans loved him. And then they saw him at the Democratic National Convention and said, oh, I hate this guy, boycott Bradley Cooper. So that as well, for some, if it's something that's a deeply held belief like politics or religion, that as well could put someone off, I think. If you're building an audience where you're very openly saying I'm liberal or I'm conservative or I'm whatever, then that's fine because your audience already know that. Whereas if you've built an audience where you're very guarded and don't mention politics at all, and then suddenly you have a book where it's overtly political, or say you're not talking about religion, and then you have a book where you're saying Scientology is the best or Catholicism is the best or whatever it happens to be, potentially you can turn people off with that as well. I think, if I remember correctly, that there's some books I've read where there's science fiction or fantasy authors, and then they bring out a book, and in the book the main character is helped by God or angels or something like that, and I've gone, oh, and put that book away and thought less of the author, because as an atheist I'm going, oh, seriously, you believe that stuff? Which, if they had built up their authorship as a Christian author, then I never would have read them in the first place, but a Christian would have read them and loved them. So I guess there's plenty of ways, I guess, to vary your work and end up putting off readers. So I guess the question comes down to, should you care? Or should you be building an audience that's honestly based on what you want to put out there? And if your sales drop because of it, then that's just the cost of your artistic endeavors.
Oh, my immediate thoughts on that is that it works better one way round than the other. If you start off your writing career writing in lots of different genres because you like more than one genre, then some of them won't go anywhere, and maybe you'll build up a couple of series from the ones that people really love, because if you like a genre and you've got an audience for it, you're more likely to write more books like that. And you've already got the other lines. Maybe they're not doing anything, but you can fill them in almost as a palate cleanser. And because they haven't got momentum, you're not losing momentum by not bulking them out quickly. Whereas if you start off writing something, so if you write 6 military sci-fi books in a series, and then you release a comic fantasy book, you're losing the momentum on your military sci-fi series. But it's not, that military sci-fi series hasn't given you anything more that's likely to put your fantasy series up the rankings than if you'd done the fantasy series to begin with. So I think potentially it's better to start off writing what you want, moving from genre to genre, rather than building up your brand, getting your brand to the point where people associate you with the thing, and only then trying to get something else to work. It's like you said with Kevin Smith, he had a strong brand for Clerks and Dogma and that sort of movie, and then he tries to release a horror film and his brand does nothing for him at that point. Whereas if he'd started off doing Clerks and Dogma and doing horror movies at the same time, then he'd still have built his audience for the teenage style comedy, but he would have been slowly building the idea that his brand was broader than that as well.
But I guess if you look at Robert Rodriguez, for instance, he's done action movies and he's done kids movies and he's done lots of different things. And it seems to me like he has to build his audience almost from scratch every time, because the people who like Desperado aren't going to go to see Spy Kids, or not very many of them at least. Whereas if you look at Quentin Tarantino, he does the same style of thing. He has very different subject matter every time, but he isn't doing an Agatha Christie closed room mystery or a lighthearted comedy or anything like that either. So the other thing I was thinking was, it depends on your goals too, in that if your goal short term is to build an audience so that you can support yourself financially, then straying too far early on would probably be a bad idea. As you said, like finding a line or two that are successful maybe would be a good idea. So try 10 different genres and one of them takes off, that might be a good idea. However, if your long-term goal was that someone would find you in 50 years' time and you've got a broad selection of things that they can try, then perhaps that's a very different question of how you'd proceed, because you might want someone to say, okay, Dave Higgins, he's got 100 books out, and here's his mystery series, and here's his fantasy series, here's his sci-fi series, and so on. So I'm going to try bits here and bits there, I guess. So yeah, I'm not sure there's a clear answer other than it's about individual choice in terms of what you want to get. Grant, we're coming up on our usual time. Is there anything you wanted to add at the end there, Dave?
Don't think so, no. It's, covered off my thoughts.
Grant? Okay, thank you all very much for watching, and we will see you on the next one.